Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of today's show, we'll be talking about our final eliminated playoff team in terms of how they will look heading into the offseason, what they could do in the offseason to bolster their roster. And it's one of my father's favorite teams. In fact, perhaps his favorite team that he supports, the Minnesota Vikings. And I do feel like headed into this offseason, they're one of the teams from this year's playoff with perhaps the most questions to answer. Obviously, the dominant one on the front of my screen right now about Sam Darnold. I feel like, just because they are in a situation where if they release Darnold, they still have a guy in J.J. McCarthy they can throw out there because they haven't seen McCarthy due to that torn meniscus that often. They don't necessarily know what they have in him. They could decide to re-up with Sam Darnold, but the longer that J.J. McCarthy sits and waits, the longer you don't know what you have in him. So that really puts them in a bind at the quarterback position. And in terms of the defense, which was really elite last year, kudos to Brian Flores, I do think that also puts them in a bind as well because they have a lot of expiring contracts there, including the top 4 cornerbacks and their 2 starting safeties as well. So that puts this team potentially at the forefront of a lot of people's minds when you think about eliminated playoff teams who have a lot of questions to answer in free agency. But I do think that they don't necessarily have too many problems to amend. It's just that you have to decide on Sam Darnold over J.J. McCarthy. And that situation is probably the murkiest just because if you take a shot at McCarthy, you risk making yourself look bad because of what Sam Darnold did for you in the regular season. But then again, remember what happened late in the season with Sam Darnold, where collapses in critical moments probably sent them on the road because they lost that last regular season game to Detroit. And as a result, they didn't end up as the number 1 seed. And they had to go on the road against a very emotional Rams team that completely dominated them in all 3 phases. So you're risking really fracturing a part of the fan base that believes that Darnold could be the guy for several more years, and then another faction that's chomping at the bit for J.J. McCarthy to finally get his chance. So it's an interesting conundrum, but not the worst in the world. I actually think the defense needs to be a prescient issue and a big priority heading into the offseason for the Minnesota Vikings, because not only are contracts expiring on this defense, players are getting older. Players are definitely aging in that Vikings secondary, especially guys like Harrison Smith and Byron Murphy Jr. And I do think that an off-season rebuild could be in the works, and Vikings fans may be saying, well, not again, because we always have problems with our secondary, not enough continuity, but that just always seems to be the case in a Vikings off-season. You always have to think about the secondary no matter what. But I think that if there's any defensive coordinator or head coaching tandem that can pull it off, it's Kevin O'Connell and Brian Flores. And I do think that maintaining a guy in GM Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah was a really nice thing to have happen, because if you lost a guy like Kwesi to another team, then I do think that his ability to address things in free agency and through the draft would not have necessarily amended this team with another person at the helm there. But without further ado, let's talk a little bit more about what I think is coming in the Vikings' future and how to answer some of these questions. First of all, I do think that they could re-up Sam Darnold. And I'm thinking of something in the region of the Daniel Jones contract, 4 years, $160 million. But I do think that there are a lot of teams out there potentially willing to offer Sam Darnold a whale of a deal that he would not be remiss to pass up. So I do think the Vikings need to do this quickly if they want to, but ultimately it jeopardizes what you think of J.J. McCarthy. And to be honest with you, I'm not necessarily certain that this meniscus is an injury that will see him recover in time at the start of the regular season. So I do think that ultimately even if you expect McCarthy to be back by the start of the regular season, you can't take that risk where if you lose Sam Darnold, DJ McCarthy is not ready. So I do feel like extending Sam Darnold could be the most apt option for this Vikings team. And I don't necessarily think you need to splash too much cash, and you don't necessarily have too much cap space to play around with, but you have enough to ensure that Sam Darnold has a nice deal available to him. But let's talk about this defense here, because I think that the fact that it's a constant issue for the Minnesota Vikings to find continuity within their secondary is pressing, but also not necessarily a worse situation because of the fact that they've always been able to find young guys whether it be through the draft or in free agency to step up for them, especially guys like Cam Bynum and Josh Metellus this year who are very versatile in their roles in the Minnesota secondary. But I feel like if that's going to become a concern, then getting younger isn't the worst thing in the world. But also the fact that these are veteran guys who stuck with you for several years, guys like Harrison Smith, Byron Murphy Jr. I feel like you might want to re-up them for that veteran leadership should you want this team to take a younger bent in the future. So I don't necessarily know if they're going to fully head into the offseason expecting to lose multiple guys, but that could be the case, but at least retaining one of them. Maybe a guy like Stephon Gilmore, who you just signed and you want to see more out of, and still has some potential left in him, in my opinion. Could be an interesting avenue. But, in my opinion, I feel like another quote-unquote failure for this Vikings group is finding front seven depth. And I think that, it showed in how Brian Flores attacked defenses. He blitzed very often, going to show that he relied more on, say, his linebackers and his blitzing safeties to get pressure on the quarterback, perhaps, than any one defensive lineman. And that's an issue because you went out and got Dallas Turner in the draft. You thought he was going to be an elite addition, but then ultimately he did not produce as much as you wanted him to. So that could be something that I feel like the Vikings could address and feel out the whole secondary situation, because there still are a lot of young depth pieces within your secondary, and you're not too worried about, say, a guy like Harrison Smith perhaps leaving, or a guy like, say, Shaquille Griffin, because you have depth and youth, most importantly, in that area of the field that you wouldn't necessarily be too hard done by if you don't resign either of them. But ultimately, I do feel like if they look for the defensive lineman in the draft or defensive tackles, Walter Nolan could be an interesting scheme fit from the interior. His versatility that has not gone unnoticed by me in the college ranks because of his abilities to get off the line quickly, and I think that his firstness quickness will be especially appreciated by Brian Flores and will work like a charm when he blitzes, because now you get more interior pressure from the middle of your defensive line rather than having to rely on all three phases to get consistent pressure. Because while I do think that the Vikings, very similar to the Packers, heavily rely on their secondary, there need to be more options, more multiplicity up front for this unit. So I do think that while the secondary is going to have a lot of situations to figure out, especially if a lot of these guys leave, I still think that the interior and the edges of that defensive front need to be addressed as well, because you didn't necessarily hit too much on a lot of options. I like, the additions of Greenard and Van Ginkel, but Van Ginkel's a linebacker and Greenard is just one guy, and then you drafted a guy in Herner who didn't turn out correctly and did not play like a superstar you expected him to be in his first season. So that could be something that comes to the light a little bit more than the secondary discussion, because, like I said, I wouldn't be too concerned if I'm a Vikings fan about the secondary, because now I'm starting to see a lot more of the young players who were disappointing early in their career step up and feel like they're ready to assume the roles of leaders in this defense should a lot of these pieces leave. But ultimately, the big question of the day here, will they resign Sam Darnold? We answered that. I do think that they ultimately will. He played too well to not at least consider bringing him back. We talked about the secondary. We talked about how Nolan could be an interesting potential pick in this year's draft just because of what he brings from the interior, potentially as an edge rusher as well. So I do think that if you're the Vikings, it's definitely not the worst situation to be heading into this offseason, but it's certainly one with a lot of pressing questions. Do you rely on Darnold for another couple years potentially and then wait to progress J.T. McCarthy? How about this secondary? What's it going to look like in the future? And most importantly, can you continue to hit on potentially free agent additions from your line and your front seven? Or do you take a chance on guys in this year's draft who I think really could be very impactful? If you answer all these questions, if you're the Vikings, you're in a good spot. You're not a spot where in a very tough NFC North you come out as the front runners, but you're still in a position where you now understand the quality of this team from the outside in. But let me know if you're a Vikings fan, especially if you're my father and you're watching, what you think about this Vikings team heading into the offseason, what they can do in the offseason to bolster their roster, because that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show. We'll be back here to conclude the week on Friday, talking about the Super Bowl, most especially 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe. As always, continue to use the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features as well to make yourselves availed to the ways you can contribute with your opinions, feedback, and input to the show. But other than that, I am out for today. See you all tomorrow.